So here's what we're going to do, guys. We are going to go through the Bible, kind of that big picture we looked at. We're going to kind of walk through the Bible chronologically here, but it's going to be really the bird's eye view. We're only going to go, dip down a little bit to look more closely at kind of some pretty key things. But there's definitely going to be some stuff we leave out that we don't go into super deep today. That's for you on your own time, or the excellent classes that we offer here at 10 Mile. If you want to jump into that, there's some resources in the back that I'll talk about more at the end. So, all right. So here we go. Creation and fall. The first part of that four-part. That four-part kind of big picture of the Bible. And the intro, this is the Pentateuch. Okay, so we're on page 6. The Pentateuch, that's just another name for the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay? And the importance of the Pentateuch can hardly be overemphasized. These 5 books create the foundation for understanding the Bible. The foundation for understanding the Bible. That's that first blank there. The more familiar you are, and I would say particularly Genesis and Exodus, obviously Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that gets into the law, that gets into the wandering of the Israelites in the desert. But it's, even though some of those can be really dry, honestly, some portions of those books, they're still important to have a working understanding of, because think about how many times, if you're familiar with the New Testament, how many times is the law mentioned? A lot, right? And so when Jesus talks about the law, or Paul talks about the law, what's being talked about? Do we have at least an understanding? Maybe we don't know all the 600 and whatever laws there are in the Old Testament law, but we have a working understanding of what the law is. That's why it's important to know those first 5 books. Also, the Pentateuch sets the tone for the rest of Scripture. Every major teaching or doctrine has its roots in the Pentateuch. God's love for humanity and our hope of redemption can be found on nearly every page. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Literally, the better we know those books, the richer our understanding of the Bible and of our faith. So let's think about this for a second, and we can just kind of brainstorm here together. What's a list of Bible concepts that show up for the first time in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? There's a bunch, but go ahead, and if you have, think of what comes up in those books. Okay, covenants and laws.
The
Creation. Sin and fall. Right? Satan shows up for the first time. Temptation.
Well, it illustrates God's compassion.
God's love for his creation. Would you say God's
compassion?
God's compassion. His anger, right? Okay, you've got male and female being created differently, right? But still equally equal in importance, right? You've got shame for the first time in Genesis chapter 3, when you've got brother killing brother, right? You've got God's sovereign choosing of a certain brother over another. Most of the names, when you start reading like the genealogies and stuff like that in Genesis, most of those people became nations. So Esau, another name for Esau is Edom, and he becomes the nation Edom. You've got Ishmael, who's the half-brother of Isaac, and all the Muslims trace their lineage back to Ishmael, okay? As well as all the Jews trace their lineage back to Isaac. You've got the 12 tribes of Israel showing up for the first time, and the different sons of Jacob, who's also called Israel. So it's just There's so many things that begin in those first 5 books that have their origin in those first 5 books. So it's just really important to notice that. A huge idea from here is that God created everything perfect without sin, and that people are created in the image of God. Those are 2 big concepts for us to get. This has an influence even on how we share our faith. So think about this for a second. When we share our faith with people, do we start with, hey, you're a sinner, you need grace? Or do we start with, there's some effective evangelism that happens that way. What I've noticed, though, in a lot of my working with the next generation, is that approach doesn't work so well anymore. Okay? Because, for one thing, what's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with me. People a lot of times don't have that self-awareness of their own sin like maybe previous generations have. I don't know if that's a generational thing or not, or just a human thing. But when we do that, what we're doing is we're starting in Genesis 3. Genesis 3 talks about the fall of man. We're saying, hey, you're a broken sinner. You need Jesus, right? But if we start in Genesis 1, God creates the world perfect. And he creates man and woman in his image, right? And so when we're talking to somebody about their situation and we're sharing our faith with them, and we're having a conversation, right? Sharing your faith is a conversation, not a presentation, right? And so you're sharing your faith with somebody, and what you do is you take them to Genesis 1 instead. You see all the good things in this world. There's a lot of horrible things, right? But there's a lot of good things too. And there's even good things in people, as broken as they are, as lost as we often are. There are good things. So if you begin to point those things out, and then you start asking the question, where did that come from? Why is there justice? And why is there love? And why is there things like loyalty? And you start asking some of those questions, people go, wow, yeah, where did that stuff come from? Well, God built that into his creation when he made it perfect. So the things that are broken in this creation are the things that are as a result of the fall. But God is working to restore those things in his creation back, that are good. And so when then you're inviting somebody into something. You're not just saying, hey, you're horrible and you need a remedy for your sin. You guys see the difference there? So that's why it's important to have a good working knowledge of the Pentateuch. So let's talk about the story of Israel now. This is what we're going to spend the majority of the rest of the morning on, is this story of Israel, because it kind of encompasses the rest of the Old Testament. You've got, number 1, you've got Abraham and election, the idea of election and promise. Important to understanding the Old Testament theology is the concept of the election of Israel. And if you're a little bit lost right now as to where we are Bible-wise, a little bit later, once we've got some of this under our belt, we're going to go back and revisit the timeline. So don't, if you feel a little lost right now, we'll try to bring it all back together here in a little bit. So the election of Israel. Out of all the people in the world, God elected or chose Abraham for a specific task and for specific promises. And so we don't always understand why God does that, but in this case, he specifically chooses a person and then through that person, a nation to accomplish his purposes. Somebody had to do it, right? So God, I don't know if that was arbitrary. I don't think so. I don't think God is arbitrary, but we don't always understand how that works. Jeremiah 29:11. This might seem familiar to some of you. This is a verse that gets used out of context a lot. But it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." God spoke that to Israel, not to a particular individual. A lot of times we take it and go, look, God does have a plan for me. He's got a plan to prosper me and stuff, which is true, okay? But that's not necessarily what that verse is saying, okay? That verse is being spoken to Israel. And then there's John 15:16, where Jesus is speaking. It says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give to you. Does anybody know who Jesus is speaking to in that verse? What's that? He's speaking to his disciples in that. So by extension, speaking also to us. Okay. So the same promises that God gives to Israel, you just see Jesus is kind of repeating that same language to his disciples, who will then establish the church. Election is God's sovereign choosing of a person according to his eternal purposes. That's what election is. And so I wish we could go into that more. It's a pretty tangly concept for a lot of people. Obviously, there's been lots of debate throughout history about what is election, what's sovereignty, what does that mean for our free will, and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to be able to get into that probably today, but does anybody have any questions, though, so far? Okay. A huge idea here is God refers to himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You guys heard that before? He refers to himself. In fact, when he introduces himself to Moses as the burning bush, he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, what I always just kind of read that like, oh yeah, God's a favor, blah, blah, blah. Just read through it. But what's interesting about that is what's God saying there? God's saying that he is generational, right? That he's generational in his thinking. That he is the God of Abraham who died. He was told, you're going to have this land. Do you know what land Abraham had at the end of his life? He bought a tiny piece of land to bury his wife Sarah, who loyally followed him all over the place. And so that promise was not fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime. He didn't get the land that God said, you're going to have this land, the Holy Land. And Isaac didn't get it either. And neither did Jacob, right? But what God is saying when he says that is, I have a plan. And this plan is not, I think sometimes we tend to get really focused on our own life and our own generation and say, well, what's God going to fulfill for me? What's God going to do for me? What's God going to do for this generation? And that's not the way God works. God works generationally. What that tells me is, as a parent, but even if you're not a parent, I think this is important. We always need to be looking at what's God doing and how do we instill in the next generation that trust in God to keep looking to him because he's working generationally. So in my own children, but also, we need to be working just on a bigger scale too, because God is generational. He is, obviously he cares about individuals. He loves individual people, but he works through generations. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So that's a big idea throughout the Bible, and we get to see the whole picture of that happening, and we forget that was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And people were dying, not seeing that promise fulfilled in their generation. Okay, Exodus, redemption and covenant. So through a course of events, that you've got what's called the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. That's you've got creation, then you've got flood, then you've got the patriarchs, which is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And through a course of events, God's people end up in Egypt. And they grow as a nation in Egypt. Eventually they're enslaved by the Egyptians. And the Exodus, so in the book of Exodus, is telling the story of how God rescued his people from the Egyptians and gave them the law and then took them to the promised land. So it's important to understand that God, so we're there under that number 2. He redeemed Israel before giving them the law. The people's salvation came before their lifestyle changed. God gained credibility before giving them guidelines for living. So there's a lot, if you guys are familiar with the story of God, there's the plagues, right? Pharaoh finally lets the people go. They escape through the Red Sea parts, and God brings them through the Red Sea, and then the Egyptian army is drowned. God takes the people to Sinai, and then he gives them the law at Sinai. Moses goes up, gets the 10 Commandments, right? and he gets, or the 15 commandments, right? What is that in? That's right, Mel Brooks, yeah. And he drops, I've got these 10 commandments, right? But drops one of the tablets. So it's hilarious. But also he gets the other commandments, right, from God. And there's a lot, when God is speaking to Israel at Sinai, there's a lot of that's wedding language, okay? In that culture, the things that a groom would say to a bride, and Jesus repeats some of that same wedding language later on with his disciples. But what God is basically doing is saying, I'm marrying you, Israel. And so God, he's like, I've rescued you, I'm marrying you, and now I'm asking you to trust me and to live out these laws that I'm giving you. So it's not like God's like, hey, here's some laws. If you really want to be with me, you'll follow these. God's like, look, I've already redeemed you. You're here with me, and now I'm going to give you these laws. So it's like out of a context of relationship. So just some verses to kind of reinforce that. Exodus 19, he says, you yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So he's talking to Moses. Moses has to transmit that, right? Exodus 34. This is God making a covenant with Moses. And he says, God passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. There's that generational idea again. And then you've got John 1:14, where it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, so just kind of giving you, once again, kind of trying to draw that connection between the Old and New Testament. John, obviously, writing in the New Testament, reflecting some of that language of the glory. The tabernacle, we're not going to go into this a ton, but just understanding the design of the tabernacle, I want to particularly just point out one thing, and that is you've got the holy area and then the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and there was a curtain that divided those two areas. And that curtain symbolizes, there's tons of symbolism in the tabernacle, which the writer of Hebrews gets into more talking about, and we're not going to get into that today necessarily. But that idea of that curtain separating the holy area, the holy place from the most holy place, still symbolizes, doesn't matter how good we are, there's still a separation that exists between us and God. That there's even a relational separation. It's not quite, the relationship is not quite what it could be because of our sin. Now, when Jesus dies on the cross, that moment which he dies, the temple, which is the replacement for the tabernacle, is mostly like an enlarged, more permanent tabernacle, because the tabernacle would travel around with the people in the wilderness. That curtain is torn from top to bottom. And I think it's significant that it's torn from the top, starting from the top to the bottom, right? And it's like God is saying, look, this separation that once existed is now, it's now opened, unveiled, like we talked about earlier. And of course, I'm sure the priests were freaking out, like all of a sudden the curtain's just like, it's open, but run, But I don't know what that was like, but that's God communicating with a really powerful object lesson. But think about that. He gave them the plans for the tabernacle, hundreds and hundreds of years before that. And they carried that design over to the temple, and then God tears that curtain. Pretty crazy to think about, but that's what happened. All right, this is a big idea about the law. Does the law still apply to us? Okay, because you've got the law in the Old Testament, right? This is a huge thing that a lot of Christians have struggled with. How much of the law is still binding on us? How much of it isn't? Like, should we be reading it and trying to live by it? Remember, there was a guy who he took like a year and tried to just live by the Old Testament law. Really interesting. Like, I mean, there's stuff you don't even think about that you can't wear clothing that has two different kinds of, mixed fabrics. You're supposed to plant your garden in a certain way or your fields in a certain way. There's rules about mildew and stuff in the Old Testament law. I mean, there's stuff you're like, wow, why is that in there, And is that still, like, am I supposed to be reading that and applying that? Because there's a lot of things that I wear, poly cotton blends a lot and stuff, And is that okay? And so that's the kind of stuff that, obviously, there's bigger things than that. But so does the law still apply? So hopefully this is helpful to you guys. Basically, there are several ways to categorize, understand, and interpret, that's that blank, the laws found in the Old Testament. Here are the two major ones. There's the traditional understanding, and that is that there's three different kinds of laws. And I think, do you guys have blanks for these?
Yes.
Okay. So there's moral laws, which is like you shall not. And that's the idea and then those laws are usually seen as always true for all time, right? Like thou shalt not murder. Okay, that's still binding on us today, just like it was back then. There's civil laws that were given by the government, or given, for government to ensure a smooth running society. And that's like what happens when, you accidentally kill your neighbor's goat. What do you do? There's rules about that in the Old Testament. How do you make that right so that, it doesn't turn into this escalating thing? Oh, you killed my goat, now I'm going to kill your cow. You killed my cow, I'm going to kill your kid. And it escalates, because that's what we tend to do as people. So God, built that in. Then there's ceremonial laws. So moral, civil, ceremonial. And that's like dietary laws about cleanliness, things like that. For the Christian, this understanding usually views the ceremonial laws as no longer relevant. The civil laws change to the standard, to what does our existing government say, and then the moral laws are still relevant. That's kind of what we... but then there's the relational understanding of interpreting that law, the Old Testament law. And that's laws that deal with our relationship with God. For example, Commandments 1 through 4 of the 10 Commandments, and then laws that deal with our relationship with people. For example, Commandments 5 through 10. And then this second understanding seeks to look at God's principle behind the Old Testament laws and then apply that principle for today's context. So instead of, I think it is helpful to categorize laws, but some of the laws, it's kind of like, well, where does that fit and how do I know? Sometimes it's important to look at what's the principle behind the law. Why does God, ask the people to not wear mixed clothing? What's God trying to do with that? And is there a principle behind that for us? Obviously, the law itself doesn't seem like it's binding still, but is there a principle behind it? So, for example, here's a law in Deuteronomy 22:8. When you build a new house, you must build a railing around the edge of its flat roof. People would go up on their roofs. Their roof was flat, and they would do a lot of things up on their roof. They maybe would do laundry up there. They maybe would dry, skins up there, or they would do food preparation or something up on their roof. That way, you will not be considered guilty of murder if someone falls from the roof. So that's a law that God gives people. Hey, when you build a house, put a railing on your roof. Okay, that sounds like building code or something, right? But how would that apply to us if we were using a relational understanding of the law? Like we might say, oh, that's a civil law, so it doesn't really apply to us anymore, probably. But is there a principle behind that? What is it?
If somebody comes in your house back then, that was hospitality, that they died because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and that's what the folks don't know.
Yeah, totally. Go ahead.
Security,
yeah. Make people in your home feel safe and secure, right?
We have a moral responsibility to protect one another. So more so than just, you're the roof raining, but you want to take your putting seatbelts in your kids in your car. Taking that responsibility.
Right. Yes. So even if it's not a law, so to speak, there's a sense in which we want to take responsibility for our fellow human beings and think about the environment that we're creating for other people. Are we creating an environment that's safe and secure for them and hospitable for them? or are we being careless and not, putting ourselves in other people's shoes? So, I mean, you guys kind of see how that you can do that and apply that. Look for that principle behind it. So, here's some concluding thoughts on this idea of the Pentateuch and the beginning of Israel here. Understanding the Old Testament brings light to understanding the New Testament. Now, this is a little bit long, this 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13, but I'm going to read it because it's going to come up later again. And also I want to show you how this kind of tells the story of Exodus. And you guys can see the boxes there on the side. Those are all important key ideas about the Exodus, that they were guided by a cloud as they went through the wilderness. Cloud by day, fire by night, right? They ate spiritual food, which was the manna that would come from heaven. God fed them. That's a whole other thing. There's the rock that Moses would touch the rock and water would come out of the rock and they would have water in the desert. Their bodies were scattered. There was times when God would just wipe out whole amounts of them because there would be some kind of rebellion. Celebrated and indulged. There were celebrations that God gave them, but people also did indulgent things that were not good as they were traveling. The 23,000 that died, talking about Numbers 25. And then it talks about putting Christ to the test. But really, what this was in the desert was them putting God to the test, right? So now let's read this with those things in mind. 1 Corinthians 10, he says, I don't want you to forget. This is Paul, and he's writing to a specific church. He says, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. He's talking about the Exodus, right? All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. So what did Paul just do there? He just talked about the cloud and the sea being like baptism for the believer. All of them ate the same spiritual food, and all of them drank the same spiritual water, for they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. We must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. That's a whole other story of when the snakes came into the camp, and they had to make a bronze snake in order to be saved from that. And he says, and don't grumble as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who lived at the end of the age. If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. Okay, so we're going to get into this more later, but Paul is taking this Old Testament story, the real events that happened in the Old Testament, and he's applying significance for us today as the church. And it's kind of and some of it is almost like a little bit like they put Jesus to the test. Like, this is the Old Testament. Jesus was, like there's some stuff in there. It's like, it almost seems like Paul's stretching a little bit for some of this. And like I said, we'll get into it more later, but I do think it's interesting, these connections. And just another example, the better you understand some of these stories, the more the New Testament is going to come alive to you. So just an encouragement to keep reading. There's the tribes of Israel, just as a reference for you. You can kind of see how the tribes of Israel came to be. They're all named after either sons or grandsons of Jacob. So, and actually there's 13 tribes of Israel, which is kind of interesting. Like there's the 12 that each one of the 12 tribes had their own land. But then there was the tribe of Levi, which was the Levites, the priests. And so really it's there's really 13 of them, but that's not counted. Levi's tribe is not counted in the 12. So, all right. Next page there. These are just some major Pentateuch passages as you're reading. If you want to start reading the Pentateuch, but you don't want to fall into the trap that many have fallen into before of kind of dying in the middle of Leviticus somewhere, then you can start with these passages, because these books are long. These are long books, but you can just read kind of these high point chapters, get an idea of the story. So this is meant to be a resource for you. Any page that has the blue bar at the top, that's just a resource for you, and we're not gonna read through that. But that's for you guys to have as a resource. Okay. Cool. Let's go ahead and we'll go through the history books here, and then maybe we might do history and we can get into some of the poetry books before we take another break. So the history books, this is just to give you guys an idea. Remember I said we were going to come back and kind of get the big story? So if any of you are lost, here's kind of the high points. Genesis to Deuteronomy, that's the Pentateuch. You've got Adam and Eve. In creation, they fall away from God, obviously. You've got Noah and the flood. You've got the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You've got, through Joseph, the 12 tribes moving to Egypt for 400 years, becoming enslaved. You've got the Exodus, which is redemption from slavery. You've got Mount Sinai, the giving of the law. And then you've got the wanderings for 40 years. Now, the idea was not originally that the people would be in the wilderness for 40 years. But they disobeyed God, and so God had them wander. It's like a 3 or 4 week trip, I think. So it's not supposed to take 40 years to get from Egypt to Israel, by the way. So they kind of walked in circles for a while. And once again, the whole point of that was for them to learn to trust God, and for another generation to come up that would trust God, because that's God's whole point. Okay, then you've got Joshua to Esther, which is the part of the Bible that I would say, especially the second part of this, that a lot of people are not familiar with. It's kind of a big question mark for them. So with Joshua, you've got the conquest and settlement of Canaan, which is the Holy Land. You've got the period of the Judges, which is a downward spiral of wickedness. There's a cycle that the people get into of trusting God. They trust God, then they decide to rebel against God. Then a foreign nation comes and oppresses them. They cry out to God. God raises up a judge to come and to liberate the people. They all trust God again for a little while, and then they go back to rebelling. And it's a cycle. And you can see how it's a downward spiral in the book of Judges. There's the united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. After the time of Solomon, it divides 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south, Israel and Judah. Then you've got, they've all got their own sets of kings, which you guys have a timeline for. And you'll see that most of the kings of Israel were wicked, if not all, to the point to finally they're destroyed by Assyria at 722 BC as a punishment for their wickedness. Remember, we're counting down in BC, down to 0. Don't want to assume. And then you've got the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC to Babylon. Same reason. The kings of Judah had become wicked. Babylonian exile for 40 years, and then the return to the land to rebuild. And you guys have a timeline for that as well. And you'll see if you look at that timeline, and if you compare that to the table of contents of your Bible, when it comes to books like Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther, the minor prophets, the books of Kings and Chronicles, we are all over the place chronologically. So that handout that's the exile and return timeline is supposed to help you kind of see chronologically how those books fit. And it's a little bit confusing to read, I'll be honest, that timeline is. But that's because it's not chronological. It's really not. So now, let's talk about history, because these are the books of history in the Bible. And remember, most of the Bible is history, is story. Modern history writing attempts to accurately reflect events through the causes and effects of this world. That's those 2 blanks. Causes and effects of this world. That's what historians try to do. They kind of examine and say, what happened? What caused that? Good historians will say, how can we keep those bad things from happening again? And how can we learn from that? And in other words, it assumes that God doesn't directly intervene in the course of human events. That it's all about this thing caused this thing, and you know what I mean? And it's all kind of in a self-contained system. But biblical history assumes that God is involved. And that's why these books comment on people's inner thoughts and judge their motives. Biblical history records events that actually happened from God's point of view. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking about, because we're actually studying the minor prophets in the high school youth group right now, which has been really fun to be a part of that. And I was thinking, if we didn't have the Bible, we would just look at history and go, oh, Assyria conquered Israel in 722, and Babylon conquered Judah in 586. That just happened. It happened the same way as, these other world events. Well, the Bible gives us insight to say, well, this is as a result of spiritual sin, spiritual rebellion, and not just the cause and effect of the world. If we didn't have the Bible, we wouldn't realize that was behind that. And so it is kind of interesting to have biblical history and to hold that up alongside world history. I have a timeline. I love timelines, if you didn't notice. But I have a timeline that's really neat that I think you can buy it. I think it's from Rose Publishing or something, but it's biblical history, and then they have it alongside world history. So like you see, like, the Ming Dynasty was happening at this time, and Buddha was doing his thing at this time, and Confucius and Socrates was doing his thing, and you kind of look at it, you go, wow, that's interesting, seeing when it happened along with biblical events. So if you want to get a hold of one of those, that's pretty fun to look at. Just a good reminder that these things weren't just happening on their own timeline. This is all part of world history, So the stories about the period of the Judges was written during the monarchy, okay, when Israel had a king. And we know that because all throughout Judges it says, in those days the people had no king, and every person did what they thought was right. So we know that by the time the events of Judges were written down, there was a king in Israel, and so because they're making reference to that, what's the purpose of that? Well, they're trying to remind the people that this is what it was like when we didn't have a king, right? And this is why it's important to support the king and to make sure we're helping the king follow God, because when we're all left to our own, things go pretty bad. So, and it kind of works that way through the whole thing. You can kind of look at that. So, two huge ideas from the history books of the Bible. The first one is, as goes the king, right? How do you think that sentence finishes? As goes the king, so goes the nation, right? So goes the people. So what's God trying to do? Well, God's trying to show that leadership is important. All throughout the kings, it says, okay, this king rose up. He ruled for 23 years, or he ruled for 16 years, or 40 years, or whatever it may be. And then the next thing it always says is, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, or he did right in the sight of the Lord. It's not like, sometimes it talks about, they built this thing, and they sailed these ships, and they went to war with this person, or whatever. And it does talk a little bit about things they did and their policies and stuff like that. But the most important thing to God is what? Whether or not that king followed them or followed him, right? Because ultimately that's what matters. Because if this king decides, I'm cool with idols, being set up here and there, I'm cool with people, worshiping other places other than the temple and setting up their own altars and doing whatever they want, then they are complicit in the direction their nation is going. And so what God's trying to say is, what God cares about most is what's the leader doing? Because the leader is going to be held responsible for the spiritual state of the followers. So as goes the king. And you can see it. When a king decides, like a king like Josiah or Hezekiah comes along and does religious reforms, turns the whole country around. And a lot of times, things start going better for them politically too. They get beat up on less by other nations. The other idea is, we don't just have in the history books the big picture, the geopolitical picture of, this king did this and what our nation, whole nation's doing. We do have that. But what I love about the Bible, you guys, is it goes into some human interest stuff as well. Like you've got like the book of Ruth. Okay? It's happening against the backdrop of the Judges. It's the time of the Judges, but it's focusing on one family and the loyalty of one daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. And the more you study that, the more you realize that that's a picture, it's a real story, but it's a picture of God's faithfulness to us and how he has this unfailing love towards us. it's the everyday faithfulness of an individual. In the grand scheme of things, that family, at least during that time, is pretty insignificant. But then you realize later that through Ruth is King David, right? And also Jesus. So at first you're like, wow, this is a cool story, and not super significant though in the grand scheme of things, but then becomes more significant. Same thing with Esther. She's just a random person, right? In exile, she attracts the attention of the king, becomes the queen, and is able to save her people because she's in the right place at the right time, right? Because God put her there, the right place at the right time. But so that's what's cool. There's this idea of everyday faithfulness, and then it having like huge impact in the grand scheme of things. So that's a big idea for us too. What's God trying to tell us in those stories? He's trying to tell us if we're faithful, all God calls us to do is be faithful. He doesn't call us to be great. He doesn't call us to be influential. He just calls us to be faithful, and the influence comes later, right? The greatness maybe comes out of our willingness to be faithful. But all he calls us to is faithfulness. And so those are two big ideas in the history books of the Bible. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We'll take a break. And then between that break and lunch, we'll talk about Hebrew poetry. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. But we'll take a quick break here. We'll come back in about 5 minutes. Okay?